Thank you very much, Yanis, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Lizette, for having me and for inviting me. I must add that if your students would then click on my Wikipedia page, it would say historian. If they click that far. But the first Google information indeed is journalist, to which a friend of mine who is a journalist alerted me, and he wasn't that happy about it either, because he of course knows I'm not a journalist. So I thought, because this is a nice and informal setting, I think it's the first time I've been on a podium where I'm allowed to have a glass of wine, that I'll keep it a little informal and just talk about what happened to, well, it kind of happened to me. Of course, I had something to do with it, so not without agency, but maybe that is also something we can talk about, because I've also had the experience that you send something out there on social media and then it turns into something that was not exactly planned. And it even happens if you're consider yourself a kind of person who's not completely naive about social media. So I'm a historian of Eastern Central Europe, so especially Russia and Ukraine. Also do a bit of Polish history. I'm working on a book right now about the end of the Soviet Union from a Ukrainian-Polish perspective. And I suppose the first time I felt the urge to kind of step out of the academic sphere was actually when Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014. Because that's the first time I really noticed, and maybe that also already says something about our discipline, just how Russocentric and in a way colonial German images of Ukraine were. And it just made me annoyed. I was just annoyed about it. So one of the first thing I did actually was to write letters to the editor. And then my husband at some point said to me, can you stop writing these stupid letters to the editor and write a proper article, essay? And maybe also typical for an academic, possibly also typical for a female academic. I said, because at that point I was working on my dissertation, which was dedicated to 19th century Russian imperial history. I had done a bit of work on Crimeas, and then the Crimean Tatars and specifically, so I knew that this whole Crimea has always been Russian is just false. But I kind of said to him, I don't know. I'm a PhD student and I don't know that much about modern Ukraine. I'm not sure that would be good if I pretended to know more than I do. But then he had this great argument, because he said back to me, I think you know more than Jakob Augstein. And Jakob Augstein maybe the Germans probably know him as a journalist who also became a well-known journalist because his father was the the founder of Der Spiegel, and he had a monthly columnist at that point at Spiegel Online, which I would read every Monday, and I would get worked up about it every time. And so my husband basically says, so there's this guy, and he's talking loads about Ukraine, NATO, and Russia, and he absolutely knows nothing, and you're too scared to kind of write something from your perspective. So I did a little blog article, and then actually kind of ironically, my first bigger text, I think, was a very negative review of a kind of former German journalist turned pro-Russian propagandist, Gabriele Krone-Schmalz, called Russland verstehen, who would, let me think, 7 years later take me to court. Also not planned. But also the first experience at this point was that if you're at that stage, there's also a lot of gatekeeping in the media. So I think I wrote to 10 journals and newspapers before one decided to let kind of a junior PhD student write a review about a book which became a bestseller and was very successful in Germany. And then I kind of regularly wrote books which were now, I think, unbelievably fair negative reviews of these so-called Russlandversteher, people who understand Russia and who really did not understand Russia but were just defending the policy of the Kremlin. And I was not that active on Twitter. That's indeed where I started. I did join Twitter also in 2015, but I never had a plan. And when the full-scale invasion happened in February 22, I started posting like mad. And it was nothing, I never had like a strategy. How do you as a historian of Ukraine try to, reach the public sphere about what is going on, try to counter pro-Russian narratives. It was an emotional reaction, also I think a reaction from a position of helplessness, because I think as everybody in this room who has friends in Ukraine, colleagues from Ukraine, knows, or it's also a challenging moment when you see places where you've been with students being bombed. And at the same time, these kind of people in this public sphere saying Ukraine should just surrender and basically accept Russian occupation. But I think that was also something which is part of the story, possibly for many of us, because I'm not the only one who engages in these kind of debates on social media. We're getting into something, at least I can say for myself, I don't really understand. I don't really understand the algorithm. I don't really understand how it works, and I still don't really understand why within a couple of months I suddenly had a following 10,000, 15,000, 20,000, 25,000. But at some point I had this following and I thought, well, now I might as well use it. And now I have a voice and can do something with it to support a country which has been attacked. And I think that's also something maybe which is, you could say, a positive thing about social media, especially in Germany. There is a lot of gatekeeping. And for me, I had done a few pieces in the traditional media, but it was more like that the more visible I became on Twitter, the more traditional media would ask me to write for them. So it was kind of and you could say that was a democratic element of the whole thing, because normally, like a female postdoc with no professor title is not the first address for traditional media houses to ask about what she thinks about what is going on. But for the kind of way you also, I said in the beginning, sometimes things happen you didn't really plan, and of course this is what happens on what was then Twitter. You don't have control of what happens with your tweet that is out there. And I very vividly remember one such tweet, which I wrote in reaction to the first interview with former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder in the New York Times. And I was so annoyed that I wrote a very, one might say aggressive, but I think I still stand by the tweet. It was true what I said, but I wrote it very annoyed. I was alone in Warsaw. My husband was not there, and I wrote it in my laptop, clapped and put down my notebook, went to bed. And then the next morning it had gone viral, and I was cited with this tweet in Spiegel Online, one of the leading online journals in Germany, and of course not as Sam user of Twitter, but as Dr. Franziska Davies from Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich. And I was like, ooh, okay. And after that, I had to promise to my husband never to tweet again after I had a glass of wine, which I had that evening. But I think that's also, because then it's out there, and then it's out there, people see it, your fellow academics see it, and they might think, that's not the way we academics put our thoughts to paper. So, and I think that's also something which I thought about possibly too late, but I probably wouldn't have changed my behavior anyway. But I also remember thinking, I can't remember, maybe May, June 2022, okay, maybe that was it with the academic career. Too many people are now annoyed with me. I've been too aggressive to too many professors. But hey, at least I did what I thought was right. So that's okay. I think what I also is also something I learned is that there is still, and maybe this is changing, but there is still a traditional view of the public intellectual, of this is a tendency, it's not always like that, but of the over 50 male professor who is laid back and does not get emotional, or is very analytical, which of course is a construct in itself. And so and I think this actually, I don't know, because I don't understand actually how social media works, but I think one of the reasons why people started following me was not only that there was like just a gap of knowledge about Ukraine, which suddenly became so visible, and I was one of the people on Twitter offering some kind of a was making an offer basically for information about Ukraine. So I wrote these long threads explaining the history of Ukraine, and I also promoted an online lecture on Twitter, and like over 300 people signed up. So I did an online lecture every week about Ukrainian history. But I think another reason was that I was annoyed, and I showed that I was annoyed, and people could identify with that. But then very quickly, and this has been a persistent topic, very often you then get accused of activism. And if you're an activist, you can't be a serious scholar. There's like the tension between these two things. And I personally don't think that's true. I think activism, the activism as a scholar, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm not an activist. I think that would be wrong. I mean, clearly I have taken on this role, as I have done others. But if you base it on your knowledge and on your expertise, then it doesn't delegitimize you as a scholar. And I've actually yet to find the person who has shown me in my academic work since then that I'm somehow turned into this crazy activist who can't make a proper argument in an academic paper. And I've also noticed, not always, but there is also a tendency, this reproach that you've become an activist and kind of left the scholarly field is very often formulated by male senior academics who are, let's say, have more sympathies towards Russia than me. And who also, and I think that's really the point, and something I really also think, junior academics should think about this. To get immediately kind of skeptical if somebody says, professor or not, I'm not an activist. I'm just a scholar. I'm being very, rational and analytical. And that crazy woman back there, she's an activist. She's really emotional. Because, I mean, this idea that you have to fulfill a certain way of speaking to be a scholar, I mean, that's also just to say I'm being the rational, analytical person here. It's just a performance act. It doesn't mean you're actually being very analytical and rational and formulating a good argument. So we always look at the arguments. And then, of course, this is also a very specific event which kind of led to me becoming an activist or entering the public sphere, a genocidal war. So it's not like, actually a professor of economics once said to me, I really feel your frustration when you see kind of people who are not actually very competent speak about your field. We also have that in economics, but I mean, at least it's only economics, it's not a matter of life and death like it is when what you're speaking about. And a good friend and colleague of mine who's a historian of the Holocaust, and who's actually also one of the people I met via Twitter and I'm now friends with. It was very funny when I was at her wedding and people asked me, so how do you know her? And I said, via Twitter. That's how we met. And she always says, if we don't get worked up and emotional about genocide, then who are we? Then another, again, obviously not planned, challenge was getting taken to court by one of these very vocal pro-Russian propagandists in Germany, this former colleague, former journalist, former journalist, who managed to kind of build up a career in Germany as a Russia expert, even though she turned into a kind of Kremlin supporter very, very quickly, and who I kept criticizing on Twitter. And at some point she took me to court, and that was, for one, to some extent even a positive experience, because from my colleagues on an individual level, there was a lot of support, there was a lot of solidarity, and there was a kind of fundraising campaign for my legal costs, and within 2 days, my colleagues collected 20,000 euros, and I actually needed that. I mean, not quite, but like it is very expensive. Even if you're right in the end, I won, but it was still very expensive. And without this funding campaign, I really would have had to pay a lot of it myself. I would have had to pay 11,000 euros just myself. I always had this idea that when you win, you get everything back. Not true. Not true. But there's also the other side of the story, and there was several fronts in which she tried to silence me, I guess. I mean, I think this is what you call SLAPP, so strategic law school against, not law school, strategic lawsuit against public participation. She tried it on many levels. I can't talk about the details on a different level for legal reasons, but I can say that I had absolutely no institutional support, so no support from the university, to the contrary. And this, of course, is like just notwithstanding my case, a problem. If scholars in their field of expertise, and that can be actually many fields, many can be, we had, I actually had, which was very sweet, a professor of medicine call me after an interview, and just on my office phone, and said, I really support you, and I really feel you. I know what you're going through after COVID. So because this whole kind of experience of getting attacked, also, that's maybe something, because I don't want to talk too long, we can also speak about. Of course, you also get quite frustrated, aggressive emails, not even to speak of what is posted about you on social media. And then there's also this, there's a lot of misogyny, so some of that you should just not, but you see it, so you can't unsee it. But there's also like a part of was also part of the experience, is kind of personal attacks, and how to deal with them. But here again, solidarity really helped, because maybe Yannis, I would be interested to know whether you've had the same experience. I now have networks after 2022 I never had before. So also talking to military experts, talking to people from the cultural field, it's like this war has created networks which should have been there sooner, but they weren't. And some female experts, and there's also people from Germany will know her, Claudia Major, who's a military expert, Sabine Fischer, who's an expert on Russia. We kind of got together and said, okay, and this is also an idea which developed on Twitter, we're going to do an evening about misogyny towards women experts. And we did that for the first anniversary of the full-scale invasion, and it was really great, because we collected, like we sent everything we had, or more or less everything that we had, from emails and nasty posts and all this this awful anti-women stuff we sent to the theatre in Hamburg, which is a great theatre, and they made a wonderful evening out of it with actors reading these posts, and it was so great because sometimes it was so funny. Like when you have these great actors read these really stupid posts, like smiley emoji, smiley emoji, smiley emoji, and then it would just be so funny and also empowering. But then there were moments where Claudia and I were not on stage; we were in the audience, but where we both kind of had tears in our eyes, because there was an element of real violence in some of these, and then like rape fantasies and things like that in some of these tweets. So yeah, that was another also kind of empowering experience, because when it was a charity event, and the money collected in that evening was then donated to an organization in Ukraine which supports women. And then coming back to this question, like maybe also on a practical level, back to this question of activism and scholarship. I mean, for one thing, of course, if you go, it also costs time, obviously, you know, to go out there to write articles for the press, and it's, I mean, there are many academics here. I don't have to tell you that it's not these kind of articles which get you in the next round on the academic in the academic field, and also sometimes which I've become to find a little, how can I put this, a little irritating is when I meet people at conferences and they kind of look at me and say, "Do you have any time left for academia?" And at the beginning, I had like, I started defending myself, and now I think I have a good response. I say, yeah, I still have time for academia. I don't have any time for housework anymore. So that's my standard response to this. But I mean, even like, it is true, of course. It is true that the time management is affected by it, and I mean. And of course, if I had just, you know, kept my head down and continued writing my habilitation, it would probably be finished by now. And it's not finished. It will be finished soon, though. So that's another aspect, and maybe that's also, on a more general level, a challenge. You know, how do you? Because I do think we have a responsibility as public, especially as publicly funded scholars, to to kind of give our expertise back. But we're not in the postdoc stage. We're not in secure positions. You know, we're not on fixed contracts. And at some point, if you have a fixed contract, then very often you have so much to do. You have to, you know, have PhD students. You teach a lot. You don't really have the time necessarily to do that. So I think that's also just a challenge we could talk about. Then this is something I've been also thinking about more recently, and it's actually interesting. It only occurred to me quite recently. Is that regularly I am asked this question: how do you combine, or how do you reconcile your activism with your academic role, with your role as a scholar? Okay, yeah, it's a legitimate question, and I think it's something we can discuss. But I also find it a little unbalanced. That, I mean, there are people out there who have worked on Russia all their life and who I haven't seen really say anything publicly. And I mean, you could ask these people, how do you reconcile your silence with your role as a scholar? But somehow this doesn't happen that often. At least that's my experience. Okay, and maybe the last, because I didn't plan to speak about this, but maybe this is actually an interesting aspect, like which social media is one on. I mean, I think that I joined Twitter was just, 2015. That was the platform where all the kind of academics and journalists were. So that, and we like writing, and you could write, even though only a few spaces, but I learned threads pretty quickly, and so you can write. Then as Twitter got progressively worse, I started an Instagram account. I'm still kind of struggling with Instagram. I feel very old, and I regularly have to ask a friend of mine, like, how do you do this? The picture's not the right size. There's always something missing, and so still not quite, quite there yet with Instagram. I've never joined Facebook, because then I would seriously not get any academic work done anymore. But I mean, I also kind of sometimes see that a lot of, like in this field, is also happening in Facebook, because the older generation of, for example, Russian liberals is on Facebook. So many discussions are taking place there. I'm not really aware of if not somebody tells me about it. But I also maybe had an interesting experience when Vicha, which is a NGO, Ukrainian NGO based in Berlin, who've become very important voice for Ukraine and Germany, asked me to do a video for TikTok about how Russia abuses the Second World War in its propaganda. And they sat me down. But, I mean, they did it very well, like technically and very professional. They said to me, so, okay, Franziska, now you have 2.5 minutes to explain how Russia abuses the Second World War, but better 2 minutes. And I was like, oh my God. You know, and then there's this tension. I had my colleagues in the back of my head saying, that's not, you can't do that as a serious historian. I mean, how can you do that in 2 minutes? It's not serious. But then, okay, if we don't do it, if we say that's kind of beneath, well, not even beneath me, but if we kind of say that's just not enough time, that's just not enough time, then okay, then all the pro-Russian stuff on TikTok is just going to take completely over. So I did it. I think I managed it in 2 minutes, 20 seconds. And then they edited, as you do. They put, as they do it, and also not very traditionally academic. They put pictures and music and stuff and put it out there on TikTok. And I didn't look at it for a couple of weeks. And then at some point I looked at it. And I have to say, I felt really old. When I opened this and I looked at this, the whole page, it was just too much. Like videos everywhere, everything moving, everything loud. It's like too much for my brain. And then I looked at this my video, and I thought it was quite good. I mean, for 2.5 minutes, it was fine. And then I looked at the comments and thought, okay, in comparison to this, Twitter is like kindergarten. It's very aggressive, very kind of. And that's the last time I took a look at TikTok. So I mean that's also maybe something we can talk about. And then I also made the decision at some point to just leave X, as it was called then, after Trump was elected for the second time. I left it. I had probably stayed longer than I should have, because I always thought, because at the end I had something like 37,000 followers, and which is also something which you can then use. I cooperated twice with an NGO in Kiev Defenders, who organize evacuation vehicles for the front line. And I did 2 fundraisers. And the first fundraiser, and also did several other fundraisers, but those were the big ones, via Twitter. And I thought, okay, I'm going to use this as long as it brings me money for Ukraine. But then actually, and it was kind of an experiment, then I did the second fundraiser on Blue Sky and Instagram only, and I thought if I don't have the 20,000 euros after 3 weeks, I'm going to do Twitter as well, or X. But it worked, so I didn't need X anymore to reach the goal. But yeah, as I said, not really knowing what I'm doing in the end. So 2 weeks ago, somebody introduced me here in Vienna as the German expert on disinformation. I said, no. I mean, I'm a historian. I sit in archives normally. I don't. But hey, yeah, that's what happened. So thank you.
Okay. So that's the second round of applause for today. For tonight, there's probably going to be more. Thank you for this journey through your activist career, if you will. Knowing, like, sort of subscribing to what you said, that being an activist, first of all, does not preclude being an academic, and secondly, in general, is not a bad thing. Maybe let's start. I just want to ask a few questions. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of interest from the audience as well. Taking up some of these last points you raised about where to go on social media, because it's something that I'm struggling with, that we as an institution are struggling with. You build yourself a base on Twitter. I mean, yours was substantially larger than mine or our institutional account, but still, it's a capital that you build. I mean, quite literally, even as you pointed out, for fundraising. So I guess, it's hard to let go of that and to replicate it. So one question would be, like, very, very specific, like, how many followers do you have on Blue Sky, for instance? Were you able to transfer your followership, so to speak, to a different platform?
I don't have 30,000 followers on Blue Sky. I think it's something like 13,000, just over 13,000 followers. But I did notice, but again, this is just anecdotal personal experience, that Twitter X was changing in a way that wasn't exactly promoting pro-Ukrainian, pro-democratic voices, and I still have the account just because there's also, that's also, I briefly talked about this networks. It was also important for networking. I'm sure you made the same, you had the same experience, but that the interaction with just the visibility of your tweets decreased if you're not a right-wing extremist, basically. That's the kind of voices that the algorithm and Musk personally seems to be promoting right now. And also this kind of point, as I said, I was on Twitter quite long, but then, and I also experienced several shitstorms, I guess you would call them. And sometimes I would just spend not an entire afternoon, that's to say too much, but an hour of my life blocking these people, or bots, or people, or whatever they were. And I'm come on, I'm not gonna do that. And also, of course, I did also take note of this argument academics were also having: should we be on Twitter? And in the end, or X, sorry, should we be on X? And at the end of the day, if we keep feeding kind of the extremist right-wing platform which it has become with our input, they always need somebody to fight with. We're basically making these bros richer, and at some point I just felt it's just that there's no good argument left. I still totally understand why, for example, some Ukrainian activists are there because they don't feel they have the luxury to leave. They feel they have to be everywhere. And it's also a discussion. I co-founded the German-Ukrainian organization, the German-Ukrainian Society, and we also had a discussion, should we go there? And we just decided, no, we would have to block all the time, we would feed the trolls, quite literally. And on an institutional level, I don't think it's really, I think it's a good development that the institutions in particular have left. Yeah.
That leads me actually to sort of a related question, which again is something I'm struggling with myself. That basically the same thing that made Twitter so annoying, namely this constant fighting and sort of the aggressiveness of it, was also what made it work in a sense. Mm-hmm. You could build a followership of over 30,000 people because you got involved in controversies.
Yeah, sure.
That's my experience also. You build, I would always get more followers when I got involved into some sort of angry discussion, right? On Blue Sky, this doesn't happen because everybody is civilized and everybody's of the same opinion on most things. And my sense is it doesn't really take off for that reason. So my question to you also as someone who, you stressed several times that you don't know what you're doing on social media, and we probably all don't, but we get some sort of experience and a sense of how, not the algorithms, but the psychology of it works. So my question would be, how do you really, how do you gain visibility when a lot of traditionally at least, on social media, visibility is built on controversy, and you leave the spaces of controversy for sort of understandable reasons, but can you build visibility in an echo chamber, if you will?
Yes, I mean, visibility. I think you can build, and I think we can also try to look at it from the perspective because these Twitter fights. Okay, sometimes they were just with very awful people, but sometimes they were also. I also had interesting discussions with people whom I agree with on many levels. We had specific debates on certain. I actually had some very interesting, serious debates on Twitter, which doesn't really happen anymore. So I think we should also maybe but again, it's only based on personal experience, not on actual expertise for social media. We shouldn't give up on Blue Sky. I mean, it's going to become a more interesting platform if we keep posting, if we engage in debates, if it's as good as we make it. And I have to say, I mean, that's also, of course, specific to, but I think you could probably say it on many other topics as well. I mean, at some point, I think maybe first 1 or 2 years, that's what not only, because I also did these kind of just general threads about Ukrainian history, but these debates you talked about, these kind of fights, they were also always against these kind of very traditional Russia apologists, expansion of NATO, frozen conflict, like all this stuff. And at some point, I think we have the danger, and I'm trying to change that, but it's also one of the reasons why I started my Substack, to not always let, on a more general level, let the enemies of democracy and freedom and liberty set the narratives. If we only always counter their narratives, like Steve Bannon said, flood the zone with shit. If we're always just reacting to the shit, so to speak, we don't have really any time for what we actually want to say. Yeah. So I for example, I don't really think it's a good for the first year maybe it still sometimes happens, but I always tell the journalists it's wrong. I kept being asked to counter what Putin was saying about Ukraine. Yeah, okay, it's easy to do that. You can say, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. But then it's still the Kremlin, it's still the aggressor who's kind of defining the categories and the terms in which we speak. And I think at some point we have to just stop that. I mean, it's kind of okay to do it for maybe the first 1 or 2 years, but at some point we just let ourselves, we let extremists define the framework of our discussions, and we don't have any time for what we actually want to say. And I think that's something also to think about, and I'm sure it's also not only related to our topic, but also to other topics. Yeah.
I mean, this very, very much connects to another question I sort of have on my imaginary sheet. Well, the sheet is real, but the question is not on there. I mean, sort of, you spoke about these attacks you receive, and you spoke about, sort of countering certain, certain narratives, and in a way, that's. I mean, it's frustrating, but at least there, the enemy is kind of clearly defined. How do you deal with situations? And I remember one in particular. On Twitter, when you wrote, I don't know if it was in Süddeutsche or was it in Spiegel, something about Ukraine and the Second World War and Bandera. And Ambassador Melnik went mental like he used to, and quite often with good reason, but in that case he said, like, shame on you, Ms. Davies, and whatever, for daring imply that Bandera or Ukrainians, whatever, had something to do with the Holocaust. I think that was kind of the issue. So how do you deal with that? When basically when any, and that I think that also connects to this point, activism scholarship, because as a scholar you want to add nuance, and you need to add nuance, and you cannot brush over certain things. So you also talk about things that are sort of painful for the side that you are supporting, and then they turn against you in this particular instance. How do you deal with that?
I think in this particular instance, I mean, we already had a special relationship, Andrei Melnik and I. But I kind of, okay, good question. I do actually think about what is kind of worth getting into right now. And that was just a situation where he had really made a big mistake by talking the way he did about the organization of Ukrainian nationalists in a well-watched, it's not really a podcast, it's Radikal Jung, what is it called?
Was it the Young and Naive?
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
one.
It was that, Young and Naive. But I kind of, okay, but then it also, I mean, okay, several things. I'm right now when people still ask me, it doesn't happen that often anymore, about Bandera, it is, I think, problematic in the sense that it's very often a context which is abused to legitimize a kind of pro-Russian position. Yeah? And then I think it's like the bombing of Ukraine, the murdering of Ukrainian civilians has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with the fact that there are Bandera statues in Ukraine. I mean, I don't like them, you know, I also feel very uncomfortable when I see them, and I've written about this. So on the one hand, I think it's important to show, and that is a challenge, but that's exactly the challenge. You can, of course, you write about these dark sides of Ukrainian history, about the history of Ukrainian nationalism, and at the same time, politically support Ukraine. I mean, that just doesn't exclude each other, not at all. But yeah, specifically, what kind of fights do you get into? And I think, for example, with this fight with Melnik, I can't remember. I've had several fights with him, but at some point, just don't go there. Just ignore it. You know, say what you have to say, because I do say when he did this, and it was very public, and I think in the end it was basically the reason why he had to leave Berlin. Well, at least there was a kind of timely, that's quite possible. Yeah. But then you do have the responsibility, once you've become this voice, to react. You know, and then I can't really stay silent now. So I think it was important for me at that point to say something about these positions or what he had said, and it was just like historically inaccurate what he had said about the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, but not necessarily to get into a big fight with Melnik personally. You know, just to kind of stick to the issue, and I mean, it does. Also, it's like not necessarily somebody as prominent as Melnik, but other Ukrainians also attacked me because, and I understand that completely, because I felt, why are you writing about this now while our cities are being bombed? Yeah, and I understand that, but I mean, I think that's okay. I mean, I can, like, it hurts more, so to speak, than when some pro-Russian troll attacks me. But I mean, it's okay. I can live with that. That's fine.
Okay. Then let me ask you one last question before opening up, which comes back to this issue of time that you mentioned. And I mean, that's definitely something I, again, sort of also from my own experience, had on my list of questions. Like, you know, like, not in a condescending way, do you still have time to do research at all, but more like, how do you make time? How do you divide your time to sort of, how do you manage your time to combine these roles, because they are not necessarily complementary, activist and academic. I mean, they do, obviously you speak on something you know a lot about, but still, as you said, an article you write for the paper is time spent. Yeah, you don't write your habilitation, you don't write articles in peer-reviewed journals, etc., which is an issue for junior scholars. It's also an issue perhaps for senior scholars, but even more so for junior scholars. So again, sort of how do you deal with that, and also how do you, I would say, protect yourself from burning out at a certain point? Because my sense was that, especially in the early stages of the full-scale invasion, and I mean, I myself, I was nowhere as involved as you were and as others were, but still I felt like it's too much. Doing your regular work and doing your regular teaching load, and trying to write academic articles and getting into all this public, it's too much. So how do you protect yourself?
Well, one thing I just took it at some point, I can't quite remember but one conscious decision I did take was, okay, if this costs me, okay, I have to admit, in the beginning it was 1 year. If this costs me 1 year, it's fine. Might have turned into 1.5 or 2. But that's okay. That's okay in this specific situation. It's you can allow yourself to like not get everything done. You know, just be. It sounds very self-help kind of thing now, but be kind to yourself. You can't do everything, and you don't have to. You don't have to do that. But of course, I did. I did was, and then when this court case started, suddenly, for the first time in my life, it began a little earlier, but then it got constantly worse. For the first time in my life, I had migraine attacks, and I think that was also a reaction to you know what you described. But then, so one thing I think is to be kind. You don't have to manage everything. It's okay if things take time. For example, I mean, my book, it's out next week. That's really late.
With but English language presses, that's quite normal,
and
right?
yes, but still, I mean, it's quite late. But at the same time, then they also put a positive spin on it. It's now a much better book. It's also a much better book because that's something we now haven't talked about, but which is also in a way connected. Is that there are now new networks. I think a lot more about the Russocentrism in our field and how we still need to deal much more about kind of analytically grasping Russian colonialism, not only in the present but also in the past. So I do actually think it's also a better book because of the networks I built, because of the new debates I had. So also kind of to see you do still learn something. Maybe not like directly for like instantly, but within these debates you still learn something. Yeah, you because you meet people you wouldn't meet otherwise, because you experience things you wouldn't meet otherwise. For example, this is quite recently, but I was viciously, I think quite viciously, attacked by a Russian colleague for a piece I wrote about Vladimir Kara-Murza, and I was shocked. I thought, well, I mean, it was on a level from somebody I liked and respected. It was aggressive in a way. I kind of thought, wow. And I called a friend of mine who's from a non-Russian region, non-Russian country, which used to belong to the Soviet Union, and she said, "Franziska, welcome to my world. This is what I have experienced for my whole life. This kind of level of aggressiveness, entitlement." And I thought, well, that's interesting, right? That's interesting that I and she said it was very eye-opening. You went too far. You didn't only say stand with Ukraine. You went after the good Russians. Well, went after, I think, it's completely legitimate criticism. And I, and that was like also emotional, but also intellectually an interesting experience. To see how like a different kind of experience with these kind of colonial attitudes, also with the colonialism in our own field. And I think that also actually, in a way, helps you to become a better experience. So this is like the more abstract, analytical level, but on a very practical level, I mean, there are apps which block social media for a couple of hours, you need those. I now have a writing program, which I never had to have. I defined when my manuscript is finished, the writing program tells me how many words per day I have to write. So, yeah, so.
Okay, but you need these gadgets.
Oh yes,
It's not just like turning off the phone is not an option.
No, I mean, right? Ironically, Instagram told me this, but putting your phone into the other room is very important for your academic output.
Just keep a charger in another room.